experiences in her early life. In her family, she'd experienced how her father had been killed in front not only of her but the whole family. The family had to run. She and her 5 siblings embarked with her mother, but they'd been lost on the way, so that at the end of that terrible journey, only the child and her mother were left. Their siblings have since then been found, and 2 of them have joined this family. What I'm deeply touched by in this story is how happy this girl is, how much confidence and trust she has in life, in her new life in Switzerland. And I look at that and I think, well, I can learn from that. It gives me real hope and confidence when I see that this is possible. There are many stories that are very positive, that much positivity is being brought by refugees who are coming to Switzerland. They're certainly not all terrorists. We can't stop terror. The best secret services in the world cannot stop terrorists who are becoming radicalized alone. It's very difficult to do this, but putting that aside, we see huge positivity coming. We see the possibility for new relationships, new stories, and we can really encourage the curiosity from those of us who are already here to learn what these new arrivals are bringing with them. Another example is somebody who has worked in a hospital with an understanding of relationships. This is somebody who hadn't grown up with all the technology we have now, but the people who are working with this, the new arrivals, said what an incredible lesson they learned from the warmth of their relationship. So we don't need to have fear.
Raised the issue of stories and seeing faces and being changed by the people who are immigrants, refugees. And I'm finding that every place I listen to this conversation, it's what changes us is those, as you say, new relationships. I'd like to put that to the panel in terms of to talk about how to overcome otherness. It really is about these stories that change people. We heard yesterday in Canada, all the people who are volunteering to take refugees in to their homes. And every one of them who told the story on the video, they got very emotional when they began to speak, as you just did, about particular people that they've come to know. And it changes their sense of who these people are and then who you are. So I'd like to raise that question of stories to the panel. How do these stories change us, and how have they impacted your work? Anyone respond to what Simone did? Yeah.
Okay.
Maina.
Just, I think it's a great question you've asked about how we can, in a sense, embrace otherness, and I think that's because in every society, no matter how homogeneous it may look like in the racial makeup or even ethnic makeup, there's always bound to be differences somewhere, whether it's clans. And Somalia is a great example of a country which is ethnically homogeneous, it's culturally homogeneous, it's religiously homogeneous, every single part of it. But then it breaks up into little clans and sub-clans and other things, which then causes conflicts. We've seen that in Europe as well, with the wars, First World War, Second World War. People always break up into small things. So the question as well for all of us is how to do it. Now, one of the things around this so-called migration issue, when it was at its height in 2015, and for me, looking at it as a non-European, seeing people crossing borders from Syria, from Eritrea to come into Europe, and the labeling was that they are migrants. And it disturbed me because how we name things makes a difference. I consider anybody leaving Eritrea a refugee because it's a jail. Eritrea is a prison. And so if we start calling people migrants, we start then thinking that they are economic migrants, as though that's something wrong. But refugees should evoke some sympathy. And when people are refugees, then there are also conventions that then mean people have to take care of them. So I think then the way we name things also is important. I want to tell a little story. In the 1990s, I was traveling in Central America, again from Africa, going to Central America. I was there for a number of days, a few weeks. I was in Guatemala, and you walk around Guatemala, and I was the only black person. Then I see these two guys there who are black. So eventually we make contact because we are so isolated, and we have a cup of tea together. And it turns out there was one guy from Senegal and one guy from Ghana, and they had begun a journey from Africa, first to Colombia, flying to Colombia, and then driving up their way, up north. And their goal was to get into the U.S. And they said, we're going to go to the U.S. We're in Guatemala now. Mexico is the next stop. When we get to Mexico, we'll work a bit, make some money, and then we'll buy papers to cross the U.S. And I asked them, because they've been doing this for 6 months, and I asked them, but why do you want to go there? They say, look, what we have, there's nothing back home. We're going to do this. And we know it's tough. But what strikes me most, and when you hear the stories of people walking over the Sahara Desert to get to Morocco and Libya to go to Europe, what strikes you is how creative and determined these people are. So yes, there may be economic migrants, but if you're an employer and somebody has dared to walk across Sahara Desert, for crying out loud, employ that person. They are going to be hardworking. I mean, they're not going to be draining your system and your social welfare. These people are determined, and that's for any employer. That's what you want: determination, creativity, fortitude, and that's a good thing. So, in fact, it's Africa's loss when people are crossing the deserts to go into Europe. But I think it's Europe's gain. And rather than seeing them as dangerous, honestly speaking, somebody, and if you see how tough that journey is, and what people have to go through, honestly speaking, I don't understand how people can turn their backs on them. It doesn't make sense, because this is quality. This is quality in every sense of the word. And I think it's something that we have to start looking at when we are looking at all this. And the third thing I want to say is, and this particularly affects Europe, and when I look at it, it's something that worries me, is that Europeans were the original migrants, going off into the US, going off to Canada, going off into Australia, perhaps by force from the Brits. But when you hear a statistic that a third of the Swedish population migrated to US and Canada in the late 1800s, it is an amazing statistic. It's an amazing statistic. A third of the population. There are more Irish people outside of Ireland by far than there are in Ireland. And you can go through across Europe and talk about how much economic migration was done and happened. And then all of a sudden now people have migrated and say, now we don't want any more. It's enough. It's an interesting phenomenon, because I think it's a real human thing to try and move and want to get a better life for yourself. And I think one of the issues for the next few years in our world is look at how we are forced to, you're born somewhere and you're stuck with that nationality without your choice. We have no choice about which nationality we have. And maybe it's something we need to start looking at, as just the same way we have rights to do things. But nationality, we are expected that because you're born in Belgium, you're going to be a nationalist Belgium, you're going to like Belgium. But why should you? Why should you? Why can't you be French, or be Australian? We should have the right to choose our nationalities and not be pegged down there simply by an accident of birth.
I'm always struck by activists who are involved in these issues. They can give you a good analysis of the problem, but what motivates most of us who are involved is stories. What motivates us, what's changed us, what makes a difference in our lives is stories. And as we all go out from here, I hope we don't go out with, oh, I found that interesting, or I learned these 3 things. It's more, what's going to motivate us to take action against the kind of racism, the kind of otherness that separates people. It's very human to want a better life. And so stories, I saw when I said stories, some of you perked up other stories that you'd like to share that motivate you in this work.
In the space of storytelling, while it's very important to give space for refugees to speak of their experiences and speak of their narratives, it's also important for us as well to analyze the narratives that we are consuming of and about refugee communities. Mm-hmm. It seems impossible in today's world to talk about refugees without having to talk about national security. It's impossible to speak about migration without speaking about terrorism. We've highly securitized and politicized the experiences of refugees to the point where they're one and the same. And I think the ultimate insult that you can make as a human being is to lump the perpetrator and the victim as one. And so I think while it's important to showcase the narratives of refugees, it's also very important for us to also analyze the narratives that we are consuming and we are perpetrating.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah.
I think that in Europe mainly we have lived a bankruptcy and a failure of the first, second and third generation of migration. The integration didn't work. That is why today we have the reflection of this failure into the migration and refugees issues. So my interest and my meaning now is to understand how politicians will make a vision of what society we want to live in. How are we going to shape that society? As you said, Ambassador, we are going to live a huge and massive arrival of more and more migrants. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to interfere? And some countries of Europe resist. Austria, maybe France. Some countries did not resist, like United States. So I think that we have to fight for a better world, and we have to ask politicians to give us the vision of it.
Fighting for a vision of what kind of society we want to be. It's a very powerful phrase. And not let others define what that society is. I remember years ago back home when I began to do anti-racism training for, in America, white people, calling themselves white people. I would always find it interesting how most Americans with European, who are from Europe, have very little ethnic connection anymore with their European ancestry. They don't think of themselves as from Europe. And so I try to get them to do that, and I would finally make jokes. I would say, you know, you Swedes, you're just like the Irish. I can never tell you apart. And they all laugh. Are you Germans and Italians? You're just exactly the same. And they all laugh. I said, you must be the same because when you came to America, you all became white people. This notion of a white race. We invented that. We created that. There is no white race. There are ethnicities, nationalities, but we all became white people, and our white identity defined us even more than our ethnicities. It's important to look at what race is, and the reason that people say all lives matter, it's to counter what Black Lives Matter is saying, and they're saying all lives won't matter until Black Lives Matter. And actually, blue lives won't be safe until there's community policing and not the militarized policing you saw in Ferguson. So now I see all this conversation in Europe, and it's interesting to me, and I would like to know what you all think about this. It's like almost Europeans who came to America and became white people for the first time. Now it's almost like becoming white people again. Back in Europe, back to a racial identity instead of the ethnicities that you're talking about, and saying, what kind of society do we want to be? I find that a very fascinating question. Any thoughts? Yeah.
I had a number of thoughts on this, and I don't want to be too long, but first of all, I think if you're going to deal with racism, you cannot, and you've just made the point, you cannot resolve your fears or the whole question of racism on the basis of identity. We're not going to change the color of our skin. We're not going to change the way we speak. We're not going to change the religion we practice. But we might be able to come together around something more common like values or interests. The IMF has just published a study. If people can't get it any other way, business and others understand that migration and diversity is good for business. So let's argue it on economic grounds. IMF came out with a study in October